Well, I've got a visual aid here with me. Come on over here, Frosty. Most of you will recall our theme for this year is A Hero Lies in You. The gentleman standing next to me is a true hero. Gary Frosty Halsey is a native of Washington. His service in the United States Marine Corps from 1965 until 1970 included 3 tours in Vietnam, where he received the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. Those were tough years. I was around then. But that's not why I call him a hero. After returning home, he launched a successful career as a custom home builder. And he also saw firsthand the plight of veterans. In 1994, at the age of 46, he retired to become a full-time volunteer veterans advocate. He was state commander of the Military Order of the Purple Heart from 2003 to 2004. As state commander for the Veterans of Foreign Wars, 2004-2005. He served on committees at the state and national level for both organizations, including service as chairman for the Veterans Employment and Training for the VFW. Frosty also serves on the executive board of the Veterans Legislative Coalition Olympia, which during the past 2 sessions helped pass 19 bills. 19 bills. And you know how hard it is to get even one bill through that organization. 19 bills to improve the quality of life for veterans, active duty military, guard, and reserves here in the state of Washington. He was the first volunteer service officer ever accredited by both the VFW and the VA. His assistance to veterans in preparing and presenting claims has resulted in an average of more than $2 million annually in retroactive compensation for veterans in our state. Let me just tell you a personal story. I am a veteran, you know that. But I'll tell you something most people don't realize about veterans. We're very reluctant to apply for benefits. We don't really feel like we've earned anything. And we don't like to ask for help in the first place, and we don't like to ask for help applying for benefits. It's guys like Frosty who come around and make themselves available and help with the paperwork, which is not easy paperwork. It's very complex paperwork that make it possible for veterans to qualify for those benefits. And without their help and support, fewer and fewer veterans would ever get the job done. You just don't know how important what they do is. Please welcome a true hero, Frosty Halsey.
Thank you, President Bill. It is indeed an honor and privilege to be here among such a distinguished group as the Rotary. I would also like to thank Jane Adamson and Jim Dirks, who are service officers as well, for their fine work, and thank the Rotary especially for all the fine work that you do. I've got to share a little story before we get started here. I recall running into a retired Master Chief from the Navy and a retired Master Gunner from the Army, or the Marine Corps, excuse me. And they were arguing over who had served the toughest tour of duty in the service. And the Master Gunnery Sergeant said, well, when I was in Korea, I was wounded at the Chosin Reservoir, I got frostbite, and then again in Vietnam, I got malaria, I got wounded again, and finally wounded the 3rd time in Lebanon before I retired. The Master Chief looked at him and grunted, said, all shore duty, huh? How many of you got up and told your spouses this morning that you loved them? But you only celebrate your anniversary once a year, and of course there's Valentine's Day. The point is that we let those we love know that we do so quite often. We value them for the void they fill in our lives, for their nurturing they give us. We tell our parents, if they're still living, that we love them and appreciate all they have done, all they have sacrificed, so that we might be who we are today. They, after all, brought us into this world and gave us life. We honor those we love frequently because they have given us so very much. Why then is it that we only honor our veterans on Veterans Day and those veterans that have made the supreme sacrifice on Memorial Day? We set aside 2 days of the year to honor our veterans. And on those 2 days, our merchants hold sales. We may go to a parade to be entertained. We probably will spend time with our family, have a barbecue, go camping, or just enjoy our time off. And seldom do we ever stop to think about why we celebrate these 2 days. After all, veterans haven't really given us that much, have they? And isn't the government supposed to take care of them? Even though our parents gave us life, and our spouse and children gave us purpose, veterans gave us the most precious gift of all, the freedom to choose how we live our lives. It is that freedom that makes life worth living. It is that freedom that makes us want to live longer, that makes life here in the United States precious. Without freedom, life is cheap. We have the freedom to worship or not as we choose. We have the freedom to speak as we please without fear of arrest or other forms of reprisal. We have the freedom to bear arms to protect our family and our loved ones. And most importantly, we have the freedom to dream and pursue our dreams. And it is that freedom to dream that has made this the greatest country in the world. Every war that has been fought by our country ultimately comes down to either gaining our freedom or protecting it. It is the veteran that has paid the price for that freedom. And when we ask that veteran what we owed him, he says nothing. We gladly paid that price in full. Our young men in the military, as we speak, are paying that price. With all they have given us, what commitment do we owe them? And are 2 days a year enough? George Washington once said that the character of a nation can be judged by the manner in which it treats its veterans. When we ask veterans again what we owe them, they are reticent. They smile and say nothing, nothing at all. We would gladly do it again if asked. They are imbued with the spirit of devotion to duty and inspired by an undying love for their native land. Abraham Lincoln eloquently stated our commitment to our veterans in his second inaugural address: with malice toward none, with charity for all. With firmness in the right as God gives us to see right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the burden of battle, and for his widow and his orphan. Looking back in time, we have not always honored the commitment we as a nation have to our veterans. For example, the veterans of World War I. When they returned home, they were promised a war bonus for the sacrifices they made in Europe. In 1930, our country was in the middle of a depression, and the veterans had not yet received their war bonus, but they needed that money to feed their families. They marched on Washington, D.C. Many of you have probably seen pictures of the shanty towns on the Capitol Mall. Because they had the audacity to ask for what had been promised them, the Army ordered a cavalry charge in our nation's capital, and over 9,000 of our veterans and their families lost their lives. That is not something we as a nation are very proud of. Veterans have paid the price once again for our freedom. But because of their actions in 1930, the World War II veteran came home to the most comprehensive veterans entitlement package in the history of warfare. The entire nation had united and mobilized behind them to make sure they had what it took to get the job done. And when it was done, we as a nation made sure that we knew they were they knew they were appreciated. The World War II veterans returned home, bought houses on the VA loan program, went to school with the GI Bill, got jobs if they wanted to work because of veterans' preference, and if they chose not to work, the government paid them $40 a week for up to a year. Bear in mind that $40 a week was a lot of money then, considering the average apartment rented for about $30 a month. A new Chevy cost $1,600, and you could buy a home for less than $10,000. They raised a family and retired thinking that they had it made. They had free health care at the VA hospitals regardless of the reason for need. If they wanted to be farmers, they could apply for a land grant. My own stepfather, because he was a World War II veteran, was able to buy a 320-acre farm, in eastern Washington's Columbia Basin project for right about $2,000. That was in 1959. Many veterans didn't bother to file disability claims with the VA. They are resident, they had good jobs, they didn't really need anything from our government, and they asked for very little from us. What they did not count on was living 10 to 20 years beyond their life expectancy, and consequently, they have outlived their money. So they come to us now hoping that we can help them with their VA claims, which are legitimate claims. They were seriously injured while they served our country during World War II. But with the lapse of over 60 years and the fire in St. Louis, where so many records were destroyed, developing their claims becomes more and more difficult. Health care is no longer free at the VA hospitals unless you have a service-connected disability or are a veteran and impecunious. When our veterans returned from Korea, they had essentially the same benefits package as did the World War II veterans. However, Korea was not a war. It was just a police action, so our veterans were told to go home and forget about it. They didn't have the 12 months gratuity pay, nor were they eligible for land grants, but otherwise their entitlements were fair. When the veterans returned home from Vietnam, there was anti-war sentiment here at home. Veterans had garbage thrown on them. It did not matter that they had not asked for the war. They had enlisted and served because, like their fathers and grandfathers before them, they were filled with that same duty to devotion and love for our country. They obeyed orders and went to Vietnam. They could still go to school on the GI Bill and buy a home with the VA loan, but the VA loan was usually 1% to 2% higher than a conventional loan. There were not as many jobs, and the only veteran's preference was for a civil service position. And by the mid-'80s, veterans were way down on the list after minorities, women, and immigrants. Equality had become more important to us than freedom. Getting health care at the VA hospitals was difficult, and the VA hospitals had become third-rate facilities. The VA started hiring foreign doctors that were not even licensed to practice medicine in the United States, and few of them spoke English. Veterans became unknowing guinea pigs for experimental medicine. PTSD had become a major issue after it was finally recognized in 1982. as an anxiety disorder. America, then tired of war, dishonored our veterans. If you're a Vietnam veteran especially and made a prospective employer privy to that fact, chances are pretty good you would not get hired. We started becoming aware that we had homeless veterans. Imagine that. Our nation's heroes sleeping under bridges and sleeping in dumpsters and eating garbage just to survive. Imagine that. Then, too, many of our veterans returned or ended up in prison because they were unable to readjust when they got home. In the mid-'80s, after the 1980 census, the Justice Department released facts that over 300,000 Vietnam veterans have served time in prison for felony convictions. Another 120,000 of them committed suicide. Chemical management became a VA form of treatment. They handed out dummy drugs. If we can turn the people into zombies, then they are more easy to manage, and we can balance our budget. Our nation had become tired of deficit spending and demanded that Congress balance the budget. A lot of that was done on the backs of veterans. For a long time, if a veteran retired from the military and had a service-connected disability, he paid for his disability compensation out of his retirement pay. Where's the justice in that? When we examine veterans' entitlements today, we see a dramatic reduction in the way of available dollars per veteran compared to post-World War II. Congress, in its short-sighted wisdom during the last administration, flatlined the budget, calculating that World War II and Korea veterans would die and that the dollars being spent on them could be spent on Vietnam and younger veterans. They failed to allow for the World War II and Korea veterans living 10 to 20 years beyond their life expectancy, and they failed to allow for the Vietnam veterans experiencing health care problems 10 years beyond their chronological age. As a result, VA became some place that we didn't want to go and something we didn't want to have to deal with. Currently, veterans from the Gulf War, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Noble Eagle, and the other conflicts that are part of the global war on terrorism see veterans coming home. They can still buy a home with a VA loan. They'll pay, of course, a couple more percentage points than we would with a conventional loan, but they can afford it, right? And the GI Bill, the Montgomery GI Bill we have today, if you participate in the savings program, then you'll have education benefits when you get out. Unfortunately, many of our young military today are junior enlisted and have families. Their military pay is low enough that their families qualify for food stamps. They don't have the money to participate in the Montgomery GI Bill. They don't save that money. They don't get their SOL when it comes to going to school when they get out. Unless they have a service-connected disability, they will not be entitled to VA health care after the first 2 years following release. And then, only if they have served overseas in the global war on terrorism. With dramatic reduction in our military since Vietnam, we must now rely on the total force concept. Our National Guard and reserves are deployed as if they were active duty. For them, deployment requires often unbearable sacrifices. They give up good-paying jobs in their community to fulfill their commitment to us. Some lose their homes. Their families and dreams are put on hold while they fulfill that commitment to us. The families, because they live in our communities and not on military bases, frequently do not have access to the commissary and exchange or to medical services the way that active duty families would when their loved ones deploy. And when the veteran returns home, all too often his job is not available, especially if his employer has less than 50 employees. Sure, the law says that employers must give the returning veteran his or her job back, or at least an equivalent position at the same pay. Employers, all too often, bear in mind there are several good employers out there, but all too often an employer will give a returning veteran his job back, or an equivalent job. He'll put him off in a corner somewhere, load him up with garbage details and mundane duties, till the veteran gets disgusted with his job and quits. He no longer has protection under the USERRA Act. When we think about our veterans, we frequently visualize old men that sit around telling war stories and playing cards. That is a quaint stereotype. It's far from accurate, but it's quaint. Let me tell you a story about 5 young National Guardsmen I met a couple years ago on my annual trip to Washington, D.C. I always make it a point to stop by and visit the wounded in Bethesda and at Walter Reed. Of these 5, they all belonged to the same MP company. One was a young lady, she was 18 years old, and her father was state commander with Military Order of the Purple Heart with me. He was from Wisconsin. When she deployed, he told her not to come home eligible for his organization. She was afraid to go home and face her dad. She had her legs blown up. She'd received a shrapnel wound to her abdomen and couldn't have children. She was 18 years old. Another young woman had joined the National Guard and was a sergeant in that same MP company, had lost her left eye, and her whole left side was mangled by an improvised exploding device. In civilian life, she had been married, had 2 sons, and was a registered nurse, making over $82,000 a year. The Army would not even give her enough money to go home so that she could stay with her kids on convalescent leave. I went to our own Congressman Jay Inslee, and he arranged to use his frequent flyer miles to get that young sergeant home. I'm going to go on. I could go on, but I'm running short on time. What I want to do is especially thank you and invite you to join us as partnership as we go about trying to help out the homeless veterans. And as we go about our lives, please join us in trying to make every day in this great nation Veterans Day. There's a sign on a sentry booth on the island of Gibraltar that reads, "In times of trouble, in times of war, God and the soldier we all adore." When trouble's done and things are righted, God is forgotten and the soldier is slighted. Please join us in making sure that the soldier, the sailor, the veteran is never again slighted in this country. Thank you very much. Bill?
Let me just say that there's a guy that practiced what he preaches. I cannot reiterate enough how much the difference the volunteers that are out there helping our veterans make. And thank you to all of you who do that. Thank you to all the veterans here today and to all the other program participants. Quite a program today. Next week, November 15th. Now, if you read the Seattle Times today, you're probably having a little deja vu because they have next week's program in there today. I don't know how that happened, Don, do you? But Don Nielsen is going to be our speaker next week, and the op-ed that was going to appear next Wednesday appeared today. So all of you get to Seattle Times and read that, and you'll be ready for next week. That doesn't give you permission to skip. We'll be meeting at the Red Lion, and Don Nielsen is going to talk to us about bold thoughts on public education, a very timely topic. We'll also hear from our district governor, Mike Montgomery, again. And speaking of speakers, you know, I was just interviewed by Rotarian. There'll be an article in Rotarian magazine about top quality speakers. Some of you probably heard this morning the news. Our Secretary of Defense has resigned. And the new secretary that's been nominated or will be nominated by President Bush is Robert Gates, a speaker right here at this podium not very long ago, which I think says an awful lot about the quality of this club. Which brings us, don't forget about bowling. When's bowling? November 14th. Ken, Doreen, stand up. Look at that. November 14th at the garage. And it's just going to be a rocking good time. Please be there. You don't have to know how to bowl. Who's going to be? The ukulele band will not be there. But no. But there will be beverages. This week's pretty good rule. Always know where you're headed. Have a personal mission, vision, and goals. Have at least one truly audacious goal. See you next week. We are adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from Enterprise Seattle. For over 35 years, Enterprise Seattle has provided client-based economic development services to businesses throughout King County and its 39 cities. More information on Enterprise Seattle and how they help businesses grow and prosper can be found at www.enterpriseseattle.org. And by First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.